everyone, in this video I'm going to show how I painted this landscape in acrylics. Now I like to start with what is further away first, typically when working with seascapes or landscapes. So in this situation I'm going to paint the sky first. Now as I'm building up my colours here, I'm working with wet on wet blending techniques. Now from time to time you'll see a misting of water, and that's where I'm using a fine mist spray bottle to lay a thin layer of water over the top of my paint, and that will prevent that from drying out. Now as you can see here, I'm coming back in with my lighter colours, then some of my darker blues, and this is enabling me to layer more of that wet paint until I can get the level of softness that I want. Now one of my biggest tips when blending acrylics is when you create a level of softness that you like, for example this potentially, then I would recommend to dry that, so it's almost like hitting the save button on a computer. So if you are looking to make adjustments to that, you can either do what I'm doing here and add more of that paint and then carefully blend the edges so it looks like it's all been painted at the same time, or you wouldn't want to dry it at that previous stage and you'd want to keep on layering more of your wet paint. Now working with acrylics in this way, it means that it's more of a forgiving approach. So as you can see here, I'm coming back in with my lighter colours, and then I'm using a separate brush to actually soften the edges into the existing dry layer. Now one thing that you can do here is you can actually spray with water first, which you've just seen me do, and then come back in with your wet paint on top, again using a separate brush to blend that in. Now working with these approaches here, it just means then that the blending of acrylics is far more manageable. It doesn't become as overwhelming. Now this is certainly one of the most complex aspects of using this wonderful medium, and I do think it's one of the reasons that some artists avoid this medium. Now for that reason, I do cover blending of acrylics thoroughly in all of my real-time step-by-step lessons, so if they are of interest, I'll link the information to those in the description below. Now the next stage was to start mapping in the mountains, which were the most distant element of the scenery in this reference photo. Now again, going back to what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I do typically work with what is further away and then build up my elements in stages, just because I not only feel that this helps with the depth and perspective, but it makes the painting process much easier. Now I'm going to be using a similar set of techniques with my wet on wet blending, but first of all I want to capture just the initial shaping. Now this is only a small painting, 4 by 6 inches, so I needed to be realistic with what I could include. But I can certainly capture the contrast, the range of the lights and darks. This is really going to help maximise the level of realism when working on a smaller scale. Now I haven't typically worked dark to light here. I'm starting with more of a mid-tone. I'm then coming in, building in more of my mid-tone highlight, and then I'll start to map in some of my darker shadows. The only reason here is the shadows on the mountains were not really dark, so I didn't want to block in all of a darker layer, too much of an area for this mountain scene, and then have to use more of my lighter paint on top. I just felt that that would have made this painting process here a little bit longer than it needed to be. So instead I'm working more with a cautious approach, and then I'll put those very smaller indications of the shadows in separately. However, you'll see that I'm using a second brush here to soften the edges yet again. Now one of the biggest considerations here when working with landscapes or sceneries such as the seascapes, anything here where we're trying to get the perspective correct, is usually what is further away from the camera is typically lighter than the elements closer to the camera. Now this is going to really become more of a focus as we get more of the grasses and the water in place. So when I'm working with the base layer here, that was another reason why I didn't want to go too dark, because if this was too dark, it would actually bring the mountain scene closer to the viewer. Now the next phase of this painting was to start mapping in the trees, which again is the next element in front. Now you can see here that I'm simplifying this process as much as possible. I'm mapping in more of my darker trees first and then coming in more with the midtones. Now this enables me to follow the reference photo more accurately rather than trying to paint all of the trees at the same time. Now one of my biggest tips here is try to get variation on the top edge of the trees that are overlapping the sky or the mountains. This is going to really help add a lot more of that natural look to a painting rather than worrying about getting everything completely accurate. For a smaller painting here, I want to be focusing more on the values and making sure here that I'm not having anything that looks too harsh and structured. So for example, I wouldn't want all of the trees finishing on the same height at the very tips of each of the trees. That there is going to give everything more of a squared off look. Now once I've mapped those in, while I'm waiting for that to dry, now I can start working on the ground. Now here we might see grasses in the reference photo, but again, for a small painting, we won't have room to add that level of detail. But I can certainly hint at that by getting the lights and the darks. But before I can do so, I need to get my base foundation established. Now the base layer of any painting is something that I do put a lot of emphasis on. I think this makes the details much easier to capture, and I also feel like it helps with the realism significantly. If the base layer is rushed and we start jumping into the details too soon, I do feel like this is apparent as the layers are built up. Even though technically we might be painting over majority of that, if there is a harsh rushed base layer, I think that the details can replicate that as well. Now this stage of the painting, I'm using titanium white and I'm blocking in very bright looking highlights. This might seem a little bit odd for this, however there is a reason. When trying to capture vibrant colour saturation, such as the beautiful yellows and oranges in the leaves here, that's harder to do if we've got a darker base foundation. Now I've got lots of videos here on YouTube where I'm painting vibrant colours in animals. I've got a red-eyed tree frog, for example, and that process is exactly the same. I'll link that video in the description below if it's of interest. But in order to capture that colour saturation, the vibrancy and impact of that colour, I need to have a lighter layer underneath. So with the titanium white, I'm blocking in where more of my lighter colours are. Maybe it's a grouping of highlights that have that beautiful glow, whatever it may be. Adding in some titanium white, waiting for that to dry, and then coming back in with your colour through the use of glazes is a wonderful way of capturing this saturation with acrylics. And that's what you're seeing here. So everything at this stage now is completely dry. That is super important. But now with my lighter glaze, so more of a yellow foundation, I'm just coming in and changing this colour completely. Now I do also have a video here on YouTube where I'm speaking all about glazes. I'm showing various examples of different paintings and how glazes can be used. If that video is of interest, I'll link that in the description below as well. Now the next stage of the painting was the mid part of the water, and this is where the reflection of those trees are more obvious. Now depending on the reference photo that we're working from, the water might be completely still and it might be more of a mirror image of the land above it. Whereas if there is a little bit more of a surface disturbance, some ripples there, that section of the reflection might actually be a little bit more disturbed. It might have more movement. So we do need to adjust the techniques depending on that. Now here I'm focusing on the softness. It wasn't a complete mirror image as such. There was certainly a little bit more of a blurry look to the edges, but here the colours were fairly similar. So to make sure that I've captured that, I'm going to use a very similar layering approach. I'm first getting my lights and my darks mapped in. I'm focusing on a little bit of softness. It's not blended, but it's not too harsh either. And then I'm going to work with my titanium white, pulling in where the lighter colours are going to be, and then adding glazes. Now depending on the lighting, the reflection on the water might be darker than the colours on the top. So this is again something that we do need to assess. How light or dark it should be and how vibrant those colours should be are going to impact the end result of this painting. So when I started to paint the little rocks and boulders here, I'm first of all mapping in the ones that I notice first. Now this is typically something that I will do in any element of my painting that looks quite overwhelming. Now I do find many advantages for this, but one specifically is I don't have as much time sitting staring at my reference photo trying to work out where I should be. Because in all honesty, unless someone had the copy of the reference photo, they're not ever going to know if one of these boulders was a little bit over to the left or the right, or even if I've added one or two too many. So this is something that I'm not focusing on, but I do want to get the lighting right. I want to make sure that I've got about the right number, but I'm not stressing out that everything needs to be millimetre perfect, especially when working on a small scale like this. Now you can see here that variety is so important. I don't want all of the rocks to be the same shape and size, just like the trees. Now I do want to make sure that they're positioned in the correct level of that painting. So I don't want to drop these down too low. That is certainly something I do feel is more important here. But that's because I'm going to have a section of the water below it. So if I was to drop this down, then I'm going to make that not look like it's sitting in the water correctly. So again, in terms of perspective, that's something that I do want to focus on. But when I'm mapping in my lights and my darks, I want to be making sure that I'm following my light source. Now this is crucial for any painting, regardless if it's a portrait, a pet portrait, or a landscape. The lighting here is crucial. Now the lighting is also going to help enforce the realism. Now if I start to have a highlight on an opposite side of an object, but I know that that is accurate because I can see it in my reference photo, I do take a few minutes just to work out why that would be. Now an example of that is, let's say for this stage where I'm starting to add in more of my brighter highlights, if I sit there and I think, right, okay, the main light source is catching these rocks on the top right side, but in some of those boulders there might have a highlight on the left side. That could be that there was a boulder directly next to it and it's bouncing that bright light over to the left side of the next boulder. So it's not that the lighting may be different and multiple light sources, it could just be that that bounced light, and that's certainly a situation for painting these boulders that could arise. So why that would be is something that I do like to make sense of, because I do feel like it then makes the painting process easier if I can work out why that is. Now most of the time we just paint what we see, but having that understanding of why that's happening can certainly just help to simplify that process. Now when I started adding in the grasses here, I don't want to get too carried away with these brush strokes. Because of this small area, I could actually paint over some of those rocks. So here, less detail is going to help make this look more realistic. But again, my values here are my priority. Now one of the final stages of this landscape was the water. Now here I'm wanting to focus more on my softness again. There wasn't too many ripples on the top surface, so here my smooth wet on wet blending is my priority initially. Now I'm going to be using the same set of techniques, but I'm actually working with a little bit more control, just using the wet on wet blending of the brushes rather than the fine mist spray bottle. This is optional, you can use your fine mist spray bottle at this stage, but I would certainly advise that everything previous to this is completely dry. You wouldn't want to be spraying water over the rocks there if that was still wet. So once it is completely dry, you're able to then use that option as well. Now I'm using, as I say here, the wet on wet blending with the brushes. So I'm actually using one colour with the blue and then another brush for the lighter highlights. I'm able to then blend these two colours and capture some softness. Now the water didn't need to be as blended as the sky because I'm going to be coming over the top and adding in some leaves that have fell off the trees and sitting on the surface. So that's actually going to break up some of the shaping and the softness of the water. So again, looking at elements that are sitting on top can help us to simplify the techniques that we need to use previously. Now although I know the colours of the water here should be blended, because I knew I was going to be adding little details on top that would break that up, it didn't have to be as delicate as the sky. However, with that in mind, I still would recommend to make sure that the layer underneath, the water in this case, is where it needs to be. It doesn't need to be perfect, but we also don't want it to be unfinished. Because if I then need to come back in and make adjustments, I'm going to have to paint over all of these little details that I'm currently adding. Now, although technically that doesn't ruin anything, we have that luxury with acrylics, it just means we're spending unnecessary time on a layer if we know that the layers underneath aren't quite right. And that would be the case when painting fur, feathers, whatever it may be. If there's any doubt that we need to just make any adjustments to the layers first, then it's always worth doing that before we jump into the details. And for these final layers, I'm using all of the same techniques that I have demonstrated earlier. I'm waiting for that layer to dry, and then I'm coming in with my titanium white, ready to start pulling in more of my vibrant colours. Now the techniques that I've shown here, we really can use them for any situation, but we do have to make sure that we're drying the layers at the right time. that is just as important as actually applying the paint itself. Now, because tiny little things like that in the painting process can sometimes get skipped over, this is why I make all of my real-time tutorials with a voiceover while I'm painting, so that I can explain everything in the moment. Even the very tiniest of adjustment of a brush technique can have a very big impact for the type of brushstroke that we are trying to replicate. So I'm really passionate about making even the most complex subjects very step by step with this voiceover added at the time. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to paint along to the real-time version of this, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. If you have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm always happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.